The United States government tried to bury this story 3 times. Not because it was embarrassing, not because it was classified, but because the truth about what happened on January 26, 1945, in a frozen forest in eastern France was far more complicated than anyone wanted to admit. His name was Audie Murphy, and if you have heard of him at all, you know him as the most decorated soldier in American history. 33 awards, the Medal of Honor, a movie star who played himself in his own Hollywood biopic, the perfect all-American war hero. But here is what they do not tell you. The official after-action report from that day was sealed, classified. It stayed that way for 30 years. When it was finally declassified in 1975, entire sections were redacted, blacked out, and to this day, nobody outside a handful of Pentagon archivists knows what those sections say. The citation for his Medal of Honor describes an act of almost superhuman courage. 1 man, a burning tank destroyer, 50 dead enemy soldiers, an hour of sustained combat against impossible odds. It is the kind of story that wins wars before the first shot is even fired. The kind of story that gets turned into posters and recruitment films and history textbooks. But if you actually read the battlefield reports, if you talk to the handful of witnesses who were still alive decades later, if you dig into the German archives that were opened in the 1990s, you start to notice something. The details do not match. The Medal of Honor citation says he fought for 1 hour. But the ammunition capacity of a 50 caliber machine gun on that tank destroyer, fired continuously, would have lasted maybe 20 minutes. Maybe. The citation says the tank destroyer was burning, on fire, hit by German artillery. But here is the problem. When a tank destroyer's fuel tank gets hit, the temperature inside that vehicle reaches over 1,000 degrees Celsius. You do not climb on top of that. You do not stand on it for an hour. You do not survive. And yet, somehow, he did. The citation says he was wounded in the leg, but refused to leave his position. Medical records from 2 days later describe the wound as superficial, barely enough to require stitches. So how does a superficial leg wound almost cost you your ability to walk, as he later claimed in interviews? And then there are the German survivors. In 1992, 2 former German soldiers who were at that battle were finally tracked down and interviewed by a French historian. They were in their 70s by then. Old men, no reason to lie anymore. They told a different story. They said American aircraft strafed their position during the assault. Close air support, rockets, machine gun fire from above. This detail appears nowhere in the American reports. Nowhere in the Medal of Honor citation. Nowhere in Audie Murphy's autobiography. Why? One of those German soldiers said something else. He said the burning tank destroyer was not the main threat. It was a diversion. While everyone focused on the machine gun fire, American infantry units flanked them from the woods. That is what broke the attack. Not 1 man on a burning tank. A coordinated combined arms assault. If that is true, then the story we have been told for 80 years is not exactly a lie. But it is not exactly the truth either. So, what really happened on that frozen morning in France? And more importantly, why does the official version sound like it was written by a Hollywood screenwriter and not a military officer? Before we go any further, if you are just finding this channel, welcome. I dig into the stories that do not make it into the history books, the contradictions, the cover-ups, the uncomfortable truths that get smoothed over because they do not fit the narrative. If that is your kind of thing, go ahead and subscribe. Hit that notification bell. Because this story, I promise you, goes places you are not expecting. Now, back to Audie Murphy. To understand why the government might have needed to shape this story, to sand down the rough edges and make it simpler, cleaner, more heroic, you have to understand what was happening in America in 1945. The war in Europe was ending. Soldiers were coming home, and the country needed heroes. Not complicated ones, not messy ones. Not soldiers who talked about fear or trauma or the moral ambiguity of killing. They needed symbols, icons, proof that we were the good guys and that the sacrifice had been worth it. Audie Murphy was perfect for that. A poor kid from rural Texas, baby-faced, soft-spoken, the kind of guy who looked like he should be delivering newspapers, not killing 240 enemy soldiers. But here is the thing. The number 240? That is the official count. The number they put in the press releases. Some of his fellow soldiers estimated it was closer to 400, maybe 500. Nobody really knows. Because Audie Murphy kept a diary during the war, a detailed, handwritten account of everything he saw and did. And after he died, his family destroyed it, burned it. They said it was too disturbing, that nobody should ever read what he wrote in those pages. What was in that diary? What did he write that was so disturbing? His own family decided the world could never see it. One passage did leak, though. Just one. Years later, a relative mentioned it in passing during an interview. Audie had written, "I stopped counting after." After what? After how many? The sentence was never finished. Or if it was, that part stayed buried. This is not the story of a hero. Not really. This is the story of how heroes get made, how they get packaged, how they get sold. And what happens to the person trapped inside that myth when the cameras turn off and the parades end and they are left alone with what they actually did. Because Audie Murphy did do something extraordinary on January 26, 1945, that much is not in dispute. But the question is not whether he was brave. The question is what really happened, and why 80 years later, the full truth is still locked away in a file cabinet somewhere in Washington. Let me take you back to the beginning, not to the war, but to the childhood that made him the kind of person who could do what he did. Because if you want to understand the weapon, you have to understand how it was forged. Audie Leon Murphy was born in 1924 in a town so small it does not exist anymore. Hunt County, Texas. No electricity, no running water. A sharecropper's shack that leaked when it rained and froze when it did not. His father picked cotton when there was work, drank when there was not. By the time Audie was 12, his father was gone. Just walked out one day and never came back. Left behind a wife, 9 children, and a debt they could never repay. His mother tried. She took in laundry. She cleaned houses. She worked herself sick, trying to feed 9 kids on nothing. And in 1941, when Audie was 16 years old, she died. Just collapsed one day. Malnutrition, exhaustion. The kind of death that does not make the papers because it happened to poor people in rural Texas every single week. Audie was the 6th of 9 children. And suddenly, he was responsible for keeping them alive. He picked cotton. He hunted rabbits and squirrels. Some nights, when there was nothing else, he and his siblings ate the cotton plants themselves, chewed the bolls just to have something in their stomachs. Years later, a psychologist who worked with him noted that Audie described his childhood without emotion. No anger, no sadness, just facts, like he was reading someone else's story. That is called dissociation. It is what happens when reality is too painful to process. Your mind just steps away, watches from a distance. And for Audie Murphy, that ability to disconnect from what was happening around him, to turn off his emotions and just survive, became the most valuable skill he would ever learn. Because when the war came, the Army did not need soldiers who felt things. They needed soldiers who could do things. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Audie was 17 years old. He walked into a Marine Corps recruiting office the next day. They took one look at him and laughed. Too short, too skinny. Come back when you grow up, kid. So, he tried the Navy. Same answer. Then the Army. Rejected. He was 5'5" and weighed 110 pounds. He looked like a strong wind could snap him in half. But here is what the official story does not tell you. Audie Murphy was not rejected 3 times. He was rejected 5 times. 5 different recruiting stations. 5 different sergeants who looked at this scrawny teenager and said no. And on the 5th try, he brought a forged birth certificate, changed his age, made himself 18 instead of 17. The recruiter knew. You could tell he knew. But in 1942, with the war ramping up and the casualty reports starting to come in, the Army needed bodies. So the recruiter looked at that fake document, looked at Audie Murphy, and stamped it approved. They sent him to basic training at Camp Walters in Texas. And this is where the myth starts to diverge from reality. Because the story you usually hear is that Audie excelled immediately, that he was a natural, a born soldier. But his training records tell a different story. Average marksmanship scores, average physical fitness, nothing exceptional. In fact, his drill instructor wrote in an evaluation that Private Murphy seemed emotionally distant and unresponsive to standard motivational techniques. What does that mean? It means the normal things that make soldiers scared, that make them angry, that make them push harder, did not work on Audie Murphy. because he had already learned, years before he ever put on a uniform, how to turn those feelings off. A psychologist attached to his unit in 1943 wrote a report that was not declassified until 1998. In it, he described interviewing several soldiers, including Murphy, after their first combat action in Sicily. Most of the men showed signs of acute stress, shaking hands, trouble sleeping. One soldier vomited during the interview just talking about it. Audie Murphy's heart rate was normal, his affect was flat. When asked how he felt after killing an enemy soldier for the first time, he said, and this is a direct quote, "I did what I was supposed to do." The psychologist noted, unusual emotional detachment. Subject displays neither distress nor satisfaction. Recommend monitoring for further psychological evaluation. That evaluation never happened, because by then, the Army had figured out what they had. Not a soldier who needed fixing, a soldier who was already exactly what they needed. One of his squad mates from the Italian campaign was interviewed in the 1980s. He said something that stuck with me. He said, "Most of us, when we killed somebody, we had to find a way to live with it. We told ourselves stories. They were the enemy. It was us or them. We did what we had to do." But Audie did not need stories. It was like flipping a switch. He went in, he did the job, he came back. Audie, and whatever happened in between, it just did not touch him. That is not courage. That is something else entirely. And the question nobody wanted to ask in 1943, when they were pinning medals on him and promoting him and putting his face in the newspapers, was whether they had found a hero or whether they had found someone whose childhood had already broken him in exactly the right way. By 1944, Audie Murphy had been in combat for over a year. He had been wounded twice. He had killed more men than most soldiers would see in the entire war. And according to multiple accounts from his platoon, he had started volunteering for the most dangerous assignments: recon patrols, night raids, anything that put him alone, in the dark, with the enemy. One mission report from October 1944 describes Murphy single-handedly clearing an enemy machine gun nest. He went in alone, 6 German soldiers. When the rest of his squad arrived, all 6 were dead. Murphy had not called for backup, had not reported it to command, just saw a problem and solved it. His lieutenant wrote in the report, "Private Murphy continues to demonstrate exceptional initiative, though his preference for solo action remains concerning." Concerning. That is the word they used. Not impressive, not commendable, concerning. So I am curious, where are you listening to this from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. Because this story crosses borders and time zones, but the questions it asks are universal. What turns a person into a weapon? And who decides when that weapon has gone too far? The official number is 240. That is how many enemy soldiers Audie Murphy is credited with killing during World War II. It is the number they put on the plaques, the number that gets repeated in documentaries, 240 confirmed kills. But if you dig into the actual records, that number starts to fall apart. A confirmed kill in World War II required verification, a witness, an officer signing off on it, a body, preferably. But here is the problem. 70% of Audie Murphy's documented kills happened during solo operations, patrols where he went out alone, reconnaissance missions where he was the only American for miles, night raids where visibility was near zero and nobody could see what he was doing. So who was confirming these kills? Who was counting? In some cases, Audie himself. He would return from a patrol and report enemy contact. 3 soldiers eliminated, 5 soldiers eliminated, and his superiors would write it down. Because by late 1944, Audie Murphy had built a reputation. If he said it happened, it happened. But there were other missions that never made it into the official count. In November of 1944, Murphy's company was tasked with securing a village in the Vosges Mountains. It was supposed to be a full platoon operation, sweep the area, clear any resistance. Textbook. Audie volunteered to scout ahead. Alone. His lieutenant hesitated but eventually agreed. Murphy disappeared into the tree line just before dawn. He came back 4 hours later. His uniform was covered in blood. Not his blood. He reported that the village was clear. 6 enemy soldiers had been occupying a farmhouse on the north side. Past tense. Had been. When the rest of the platoon moved in, they found the farmhouse. They found the bodies. But Audie had not called it in, had not requested backup, had not fired a shot that anyone else heard. He had gone in, handled it, and moved on. Like it was a chore, like taking out the trash. One of his fellow soldiers, a guy named Tipton, was interviewed in the 1970s. He said, "We did not talk about it much, but we all knew. Audie was not like the rest of us. When we saw the enemy, we felt fear. We felt adrenaline. We had to psych ourselves up to pull the trigger. Audie? I do not think he felt anything. He would just go dark, disappear for hours, come back quiet, and you knew he had been killing people. But it was like asking someone how their day at the office was. He just did the work." By January of 1945, there were rumors circulating among the enlisted men. Whispers. Some guys said Audie had stopped sleeping, that he would sit awake all night, staring into the dark, waiting for something. Others said he was taking benzodrine tablets, the military-issued amphetamines they gave to pilots and scouts, just to keep himself sharp. His medical records show that between August of 1944 and January of 1945, Audie Murphy averaged between 2 and 3 hours of sleep per night for 5 months, and he was still going out on missions, still fighting, still functional. Modern military doctors have looked at those records. They say it should not be possible. The human body breaks down under that kind of sustained stress. Cognitive function deteriorates. Reaction time slows. Soldiers in that condition become liabilities. They get themselves killed. They get other people killed. But Audie did not break down. If anything, he got sharper. There is a theory among some researchers who study extreme stress and combat performance. It is called dissociative combat mode. Essentially, the brain detaches so completely from the body's fear response that the person stops processing danger the way normal people do. They do not freeze. They do not panic. They just act like a machine. And if you were already someone who had learned, as a child, to shut off your emotions just to survive, then war does not traumatize you the same way it traumatizes everyone else. It just gives you permission to be what you already were. Which brings us to the diary. Audie Murphy kept a personal journal throughout the war. Not an official log, a private notebook. He wrote in it almost every night, according to soldiers who bunked near him. Short entries, a few sentences, sometimes just a number. After his death in 1971, his wife gave the diary to their children. They read it, and then they destroyed it, burned it. When asked why, one of his sons said, "Because nobody needed to read that. Nobody needed to know." But before it was destroyed, one passage was shared with a family friend who later mentioned it in an interview. Just one line. Audie had written, "I stopped counting after it did not matter anymore." Stopped counting what? Kills? Days? The number of times he had gone out into the woods alone and come back different? There is another detail that never made it into the official histories. In December of 1944, Audie Murphy was pulled aside by his company commander. Not for a commendation, for a conversation. Off the record. A declassified memo from that period, written by a battalion psychiatrist, references an unnamed soldier who was operating outside standard engagement protocols and displaying concerning autonomy in combat decisions. The memo recommends a psychological evaluation and possible reassignment to non-combat duties. That evaluation never happened. The soldier in question, whoever he was, remained in active combat, and 3 weeks later, the incident at Holzweier occurred, the one that would make Audie Murphy the most decorated soldier in American history. But here's what nobody talks about. 12 soldiers witnessed what happened that day. 12 men saw Audie Murphy climb onto that burning tank destroyer and open fire. 3 of them died before the war ended. 7 of them refused to give interviews for the rest of their lives. And the 2 who did talk gave accounts that contradicted each other on nearly every major detail. One said Audie fought for over an hour. The other said it was closer to 20 minutes. One said he was calm, methodical, almost robotic. The other said he was screaming the entire time. So which version is true? Or is the truth something that none of them wanted to say out loud? That what they saw that day was not heroism. It was something else. Something that made them uncomfortable. Something that did not fit the story America needed to hear. January 26th, 1945, 6:30 in the morning, Eastern France. Let me walk you through what the Medal of Honor citation says happened. Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, was defending a position near the town of Holzweier. German forces launched a counterattack. 6 tanks, 250 infantry, maybe more. The Americans were outnumbered, outgunned, and getting slaughtered. Audie Murphy ordered his men to fall back to the woods, to regroup, to survive. But he stayed. He climbed onto an M10 tank destroyer that had been hit by artillery and was burning. He grabbed the 50 caliber machine gun mounted on top, and for the next hour, he held that position alone, fired on advancing German infantry, called in artillery strikes on his own position to stop the tanks, killed approximately 50 enemy soldiers, was wounded in the leg but refused to leave until his ammunition was exhausted and the German attack had been repulsed. When it was over, reinforcements arrived and found him still standing on that burning vehicle, wounded, exhausted, alone. The field in front of him was littered with bodies. That is the story. That is what earned him the Medal of Honor. That is what made him a legend. Now let me tell you what does not add up. The M10 tank destroyer. When it gets hit by German artillery, the fuel tank ruptures, diesel fuel ignites. The interior of that vehicle reaches temperatures above 1,000 degrees Celsius. You do not stand on top of that. The metal alone would melt the soles of your boots. The heat would blister your skin. You would pass out from smoke inhalation within minutes. And yet, Audie Murphy supposedly stood on that platform for an hour, in sub-zero temperatures, which should have made the contrast even worse, breathing in smoke, exposed to fire, and walked away with a leg wound. A superficial leg wound. That is what the medical report says. Treated 2 days later at a field hospital, barely required stitches. But in interviews decades later, Audie claimed that injury nearly cost him his ability to walk, that it was serious, debilitating. So, which version is true? The medical records or his own memory? Then there is the ammunition problem. A 50 caliber M2 Browning machine gun, the kind mounted on the M10, has a rate of fire of around 500 rounds per minute. The standard ammunition supply for that weapon is roughly 750 rounds. If you are firing continuously, trying to suppress an advancing infantry force and multiple armored vehicles, you are going through ammo fast. Do the math. Even if Audie was conserving shots, even if he was firing in controlled bursts, that ammunition would be gone in 20 minutes, 30 at the absolute most. The citation says he fought for an hour. Where did the extra ammunition come from? Did someone resupply him while he was on a burning vehicle surrounded by enemy fire? The reports do not say. Nobody explains that part. And then there is the artillery. The citation says Audie Murphy called in artillery strikes on his own position to stop the German tanks, that he was on a field telephone, directing fire, while simultaneously operating a machine gun. But the after-action report from the artillery unit makes no mention of fire missions called in by Murphy. It mentions fire missions called in by the company commander, who was in the woods behind the line, coordinating from a command post, with a working radio. Murphy's radio was destroyed when the tank destroyer was hit. That is in the citation. So how was he calling in artillery? Unless he was not. Unless someone else was directing that fire, and the story got simplified later because it sounded better to say one man did everything. Now here is where it gets interesting. In 1992, a French historian named Claude Rothay was doing research on the Colmar Pocket campaign. He tracked down 2 German veterans who had been part of the attack on Holzweier. Both men were in their 70s. Both had stayed silent about the war for nearly 50 years. Rothay interviewed them separately, and both men told the same story. They said American fighter planes strafed their position during the assault. P-47 Thunderbolts, close air support, came in low, guns blazing, dropped bombs, circled back. The planes tore through their lines, killed dozens of men, destroyed one of the tanks. That detail appears nowhere in the American records, nowhere in the Medal of Honor citation, nowhere in Audie Murphy's autobiography. If it happened, and both German survivors insist it did, then the question is simple. Why was it left out? One of those German soldiers, a man named Kaufmann, said something else. He said the machine gun fire from the burning tank was terrifying, yes, but it was not what broke their attack. It was the combination, the air support, the artillery, the flanking maneuver by American infantry that came through the woods on their left side while everyone was focused on the tank. If Kaufmann is telling the truth, then what happened at Holzweier was not a one-man stand. It was a coordinated combined arms defense, effective, deadly, exactly what military doctrine calls for. But that is not the story that wins wars. That is not the story that sells war bonds or fills recruitment offices or gets turned into movies. So they simplified it. They took a chaotic, multi-unit engagement and boiled it down to one man, one tank, one gun, because that story is clean. That story is easy to understand. That story makes people believe. And Audie Murphy? What did he say about all this? In public, he stuck to the official version, gave interviews, smiled for the cameras, played himself in the movie. But in private, in conversations with his psychiatrist in the late 1960s, he said something different. He said, "I do not remember most of it. Not some of it. Most of it." He described the experience as being somewhere else, as watching himself from a distance. He used the phrase, like a dream I could not wake up from. That is, dissociation. That is what happens when your brain cannot process what is happening, so it just shuts down the parts of you that feel and think and question. You go on autopilot. You do what you are trained to do. And afterward, you cannot access the memory because you were not really there. Or maybe he remembered everything. Maybe he remembered all of it. Every shot, every body, every moment. And saying he did not remember was just easier than telling the truth. Because the truth might have been that he knew the story did not match what happened, that he knew it had been exaggerated, simplified, mythologized, and he went along with it anyway. Because what choice did he have? You do not correct the Medal of Honor citation. You do not tell America they got it wrong. You just live with it, and let the lie become bigger than the man. The war ended in May of 1945. Audie Murphy came home in June. He was 20 years old, and already the most famous soldier in America. But here is what most people do not know. The fame was not accidental. It was engineered. Before Audie ever set foot back on American soil, the War Department had already made a decision. They were going to turn him into a symbol, a product, the face of American victory. Declassified documents from the spring of 1945 show internal memos circulating between the War Department's Public Relations Division and the White House. They were looking for a hero. Not just any hero, a specific kind. Someone young, photogenic, with a compelling backstory, someone who could sell the idea that the war had been worth it. They had options. Over 400 soldiers received the Medal of Honor during World War II. Dozens of them had comparable or even more impressive combat records than Audie Murphy. Men who had led entire companies under fire. Men who had saved hundreds of lives. Men whose actions had changed the outcome of major battles. But those men were not chosen. Audie was. An internal memo dated June 3, 1945, lays it out plainly. Subject: Murphy presents optimal narrative framework for public engagement. Recommend maximum publicity allocation. Optimal narrative framework. That is government speak for good story. Poor kid from Texas, orphaned young, rejected by the military for being too small, overcame impossible odds, became a hero. Classic American mythology. Horatio Alger with a machine gun. Within 2 weeks of returning stateside, Audie Murphy was on the cover of Life magazine, smiling, clean-cut, looking more like a college student than a killer. The headline read, "America's Most Decorated Soldier." The article inside described him as humble, soft-spoken, reluctant to talk about his own heroism. That was true. He was reluctant, but not for the reasons people thought. By July, he was on a national publicity tour, war bond rallies, parades, speaking events. Everywhere he went, crowds gathered. Women cried. Men shook his hand and thanked him for his service. He smiled. He waved. He said the things he was supposed to say. But people who were close to him during that period noticed something. He was drinking. A lot. And he was not sleeping. At night, in hotel rooms, he would pace, chain smoke, stare out windows for hours. One reporter, a guy named Davidson, was assigned to follow Audie for a week during the tour. He was supposed to write a puff piece. American hero adjusts to life back home. That kind of thing. But what he witnessed disturbed him. He wrote about it years later in his memoir. Davidson said that one night, around 3 a.m, he heard screaming coming from Audie's room. He knocked. No answer. The screaming continued. Hotel staff opened the door. They found Audie on the floor, soaked in sweat, tangled in bedsheets, still asleep. When they woke him up, he did not know where he was. Thought he was back in France. Thought the hotel room was a German bunker. Davidson wrote, "I realized then that the man they were parading around the country was not a hero enjoying his victory. He was a trauma victim being forced to perform. That article never got published. Davidson's editor killed it, said it was not what the public needed to hear, not what the country needed right now. In 1949, Audie was approached by a publisher. They wanted him to write his autobiography, to tell his story. He agreed, but on one condition. He wanted to write it himself. No ghostwriter. They said yes, and then immediately assigned him a ghostwriter anyway. The book that came out in 1951 was called To Hell and Back. It became a massive bestseller, spent weeks on the New York Times list, won awards, got adapted into a movie 4 years later. But it was not the book Audie Murphy wrote. His original manuscript still exists. It is held by his family, and according to people who have read it, the differences are staggering. The published version is heroic, inspiring, full of camaraderie and courage and the triumph of the human spirit. The original manuscript is dark, honest. It talks about enjoying the act of killing, about the rush, the addiction. It describes shooting surrendering soldiers because it was easier than taking prisoners. It talks about suicidal thoughts during combat, about wanting to die just to make it stop. Entire chapters were removed, rewritten, softened. The publishers told him it was for pacing, for narrative flow. But the truth is, they did not want America to read what war actually does to a person. When the movie came out in 1955, Audie played himself. He was the only actor considered for the role, and he hated every second of it. On set, he would drink between takes. He refused to do certain scenes the way the director wanted. There is one part in the film where his character is supposed to cry over a dead friend. Audie would not do it. He said it was not accurate, that he did not cry, that nobody cried, because if you started crying, you would not stop. They shot the scene anyway, used a different actor in shadow, pretended it was him. The movie made over $10 million. It turned Audie Murphy into a household name, and it cemented a version of his story that had almost nothing to do with what actually happened. But here's the part that really gets me. While all this was happening, while Audie was being packaged and sold and turned into a myth, the government was actively suppressing other parts of his story. In 1953, Audie started speaking publicly about something called battle fatigue, what we now call PTSD. He talked about nightmares, about insomnia, about violent outbursts, about sleeping with a loaded gun under his pillow because he could not feel safe without it. He was one of the first public figures to talk openly about the psychological cost of war, and the Veterans Administration hated it. Internal VA memos from that period, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, show that officials were worried. They thought Audie's honesty about his struggles would damage recruitment, would make the military look bad, would undermine the heroic narrative they had spent years building. So they pressured him, suggested he tone it down, focus on the positive. One memo explicitly states, "Subject Murphy's public comments regarding psychological difficulties are counterproductive to veteran morale and national defense messaging." Translation: shut up about being broken. You are supposed to be a hero. And for a while, he did tone it down. He stopped doing interviews about PTSD, stopped talking about the nightmares, went back to being the smiling war hero in the photographs. But privately, he was falling apart. Addicted to sleeping pills, gambling away everything he earned. His marriage was collapsing, and nobody in the government that had made him famous wanted to help, because helping him would mean admitting the story was not true, that heroes do not get happy endings, that sometimes the war never ends. It just follows you home. For 26 years after the war ended, Audie Murphy lived two lives. In public, he was the war hero, the movie star, the symbol. He made over 40 films, appeared on television, showed up at veteran events and shook hands and signed autographs. He smiled in all the right places, said all the right things. In private, he was disintegrating. He slept with a .45 caliber pistol under his pillow every single night for 2 decades. His first wife left him after he nearly strangled her during a nightmare. He would wake up screaming, sometimes swinging, convinced he was back in combat. She said living with him was like living with a bomb that could go off at any moment. He cycled through sleeping pills like candy, Placidol, Seconal, anything that could knock him out for a few hours. At his worst, he was taking enough sedatives every night to hospitalize a normal person. And even then, He rarely slept more than 3 or 4 hours. The gambling was worse. Audie Murphy made decent money from his films and appearance fees, and he lost almost all of it. Horse racing, poker games, high-stakes bets on anything and everything. By the late 1960s, he owed over $300,000. That is nearly $3 million in today's money. Some of that debt was to casinos. Some of it was to private lenders, the kind of people who do not go through courts when you do not pay them back. But here is what nobody wanted to acknowledge. The gambling, the pills, the violence, the paranoia, it was not weakness, it was survival. When you have spent years living in a state of hypervigilance, when your brain has been rewired to expect death at any moment, normal life feels wrong, boring, unbearable. The gambling gave him adrenaline. The pills gave him unconsciousness. The gun under his pillow gave him the illusion of control. He was self-medicating, trying to manage symptoms that the VA barely acknowledged existed. And when he tried to talk about it, when he tried to use his platform to advocate for other veterans struggling with the same things, he was told to stop, told it was bad for morale, bad for the image. So he kept it quiet, and he kept unraveling. May 28, 1971. Audie Murphy was 45 years old. He was flying in a private plane from Atlanta to Virginia. Business meeting, routine trip. The weather was bad. Heavy clouds, rain, low visibility. The plane crashed into Brush Mountain near Roanoke, Virginia. Everyone on board was killed instantly. The official cause was pilot error. The pilot, a man named Herman Butler, had ignored weather warnings and flown into a storm. Spatial disorientation. Lost control. Tragic accident. That is the official story. But like everything else about Audie Murphy, the official story does not tell you everything. Within hours of the crash, rumors started circulating. Some people said it was not an accident, that Audie had enemies, that he owed money to the wrong people, that maybe the plane had been sabotaged. There is no evidence for that. But here is what is true. The FAA investigation report on the crash contains 17 pages of redacted information, blacked out, still classified over 50 years later. Why? What is in an accident report that needs to remain secret? Routine mechanical failure does not get classified. Pilot error does not get classified. So, what are they hiding? Then there is the insurance investigation. The company that held the policy on the plane conducted their own inquiry. Their report, which was never made public, but was leaked in part during a lawsuit in the 1980s, contains a strange detail. According to witnesses at the airport in Atlanta, Audie Murphy behaved unusually before boarding. He was agitated, pacing. He made a phone call from a payphone that lasted several minutes. The person on the other end was never identified. After the call, a witness said Audie looked, quote, like he had seen a ghost. Another witness, a mechanic who worked at the airfield, said he saw Audie walk around the plane twice before boarding, just circling it, staring at it, like he was checking for something, or debating whether to get on. The last person he spoke to before takeoff was his wife, Pamela. He called her from the plane's radio while they were taxiing. The conversation was brief. But years later, in an interview, Pamela mentioned something he said. I am tired of running. Running from what? From debt? From the past? From the person he had become? Nobody knows. Because 20 minutes later, the plane was gone. Some people think it was suicide. That Audie Murphy, one of the most decorated soldiers in American history, finally decided he could not carry it anymore. That he convinced the pilot to fly into that storm, knowing what would happen. There is no proof. Just whispers. Just the fact that a man who had survived everything the Germans threw at him died in a routine flight on a day when every other pilot in the region had grounded their planes. Others think it was murder, that the debts he owed finally caught up with him, that someone wanted him gone and made it look like an accident. Again, no proof, just suspicion, just the strange coincidences and redacted reports and questions nobody wants to answer. And then there is the simplest explanation, that it was exactly what it looked like, an accident, a pilot who made a bad decision, a weather system that turned deadly, nothing more. But the thing about Audie Murphy is that nothing about his life was ever simple. So why would his death be? In 2024, a researcher going through old family archives found something. A single page, torn from a notebook. The handwriting matched samples of Audie's writing from the war. It was dated April 1971, 1 month before the crash. It said, They made me something I never asked to be. Now I cannot unmake it. I do not know who I would be without the war, and I am afraid to find out. That is the last thing Audie Murphy ever wrote, or at least the last thing anyone has found. So what is the truth? Was he a hero, a victim, a weapon that outlived its usefulness? Maybe he was all of those things. Maybe the categories we use to make sense of people do not work when the person has lived through something we cannot imagine. What I do know is this. The story we tell about Audie Murphy says more about us than it does about him. We needed a hero, so we made one. We needed a symbol, so we polished away the rough edges and sold the myth. And when the man underneath that myth tried to tell us the truth, we told him to be quiet. If this story made you think differently about heroes, about war, about the cost we ask people to pay, maybe share it, maybe leave a comment. And if you want more stories that dig into the uncomfortable truths behind the legends, hit that subscribe button. Because history is never as clean as we pretend it is. And sometimes, the most important questions are the ones nobody wants to ask.